A black veteran returns home, only to face one last battle. A black soldier just returned from deployment, finally ready to go home. He had spent years serving his country, enduring the weight of war, of sacrifice, of separation. But as he stepped into the airport, everything changed. A racist officer, stationed at security, targeted him without cause. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't random. It was the kind of scrutiny that men like him knew all too well. The suspicion that never faded. No matter the uniform, no matter the medals pinned to his chest. In front of hundreds of travelers, the officer humiliated him, forced him through unnecessary screenings, questioned his legitimacy, treated him like a threat instead of a hero. But just 7 minutes later, that same officer was called to the side and fired on the spot. What happened next left the entire airport in shock and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. Because sometimes, justice arrives in ways we never expect. The morning unfolded with a hush. The sky a pale blue stretching over the city like an unbroken sheet of quiet expectation. Outside the airport, the air was thick with the smell of jet fuel in movement, of lives in transit, of goodbyes and beginnings wrapped in the hum of civilization. Josephine Langston stepped out of the black sedan with the kind of grace that did not demand attention but commanded it nonetheless. Her silk scarf, woven in deep ochre and midnight black, fluttered slightly in the early breeze as she adjusted the strap of her leather handbag. There was no hesitation in her step as she approached the revolving glass doors of the terminal. Only a certainty carved from decades of knowing what awaited her beyond them. Inside, the world churned in a chaotic harmony. Business travelers huddled around their rolling suitcases. Mothers soothed restless children, and the tinny voice of the overhead announcements punctuated the space with calls for final boarding. Josephine moved through it all with the kind of quiet authority that made people glance but rarely linger. She had long understood that her presence unsettled some, not because of what she did, but because of who she was, where she stood, and how she stood there. Today was different, though. Today, she was flying not just as a passenger, but as a harbinger of change. She found the priority check-in line and took her place, her heels clicking softly against the polished tile. In front of her, a well-dressed white man adjusted the cuff of his expensive blazer while a young woman in sweatpants scrolled mindlessly on her phone. The line moved quickly, until it was her turn. At the counter stood a blonde woman, crisp uniform neatly pressed, name tag gleaming with corporate pride, Lauren. Josephine offered a warm, polite smile as she handed over her passport and boarding pass. Lauren took it, barely looking up. "Morning," she muttered. Josephine nodded. "Good morning." There was a pause, a flicker of hesitation. Lauren scanned the ticket, her eyes narrowing slightly before tilting her head just enough to catch the gaze of her colleague. A lanky man named Greg. His tie loosened in practiced indifference. A smirk passed between them, quick and subtle, but loud enough in its implications. "First class?" Lauren asked, more statement than question, the edges of her mouth curling in something that wasn't quite a smile. Josephine did not flinch. "Yes." Lauren let out a soft hum, an acknowledgement laced with something unspoken. The seconds stretched as she ran her finger along the edge of the passport, flipping it open and scanning its details longer than necessary. Josephine knew this moment. She had lived it before. The casual interrogation without words. The slow, deliberate dance of doubt. "I'm going to need to see another form of ID," Lauren said, holding onto the passport just a moment too long. Josephine did not sign. She did not roll her eyes. She simply reached into her handbag and produced another identification card, setting it down in front of the woman with the same poise she had always carried. Lauren took it, glanced at it, and then handed it back. "All right," she said, her tone coated in something thick. Something like resentment dressed as routine. "You're all set." Josephine took her things without comment, without the validation of an argument. She turned and walked away, feeling the weight of laughter behind her. A knowing kind of laughter. The kind exchanged between people who believe they have upheld a secret order. One where lines are drawn by things unspoken and punishments are given through the small, steady dismantling of dignity. She had heard that laughter before, and she had never allowed it to define her. The airport pulsed around her, but the world had gone quieter somehow. The weight of it pressed against her shoulders, but she carried it as she always did. Not as a burden, but as proof. Proof that no matter how much had changed, so much had remained the same. And proof that they had no idea who they had just tried to diminish. She adjusted her scarf and continued walking. Toward security, toward the gate, toward the next inevitable battle. The hum of the airport was a steady, unrelenting thing, a symphony of lives in motion, of destinations known and unknown. Josephine Langston walked toward security, her heels pressing firm against the polished floor. The click of each step a metronome marking time. She had passed the first threshold, had faced the first challenge. And now, as always, came the next. She did not need to look back to know that eyes were still on her. Some were curious, some indifferent, and some weighed down with that peculiar mixture of suspicion and certainty. The kind of gaze that asks, "What are you doing here?" without ever needing to form the words. She had lived with that question her entire life. At the TSA checkpoint, the line curled into its own rhythm. Passengers pulling off shoes, slipping laptops from cases, moving forward in measured increments. She took her place, calm, prepared, knowing already that she would not pass through this space as seamlessly as others. And yet, when the agent gestured toward her, his expression unreadable, his voice flat, she still felt the familiar coil of something tightening in her chest. "Step to the side, please." Random screening. Random, a word so easily used, so effortlessly wielded. She exhaled slowly. Of course. She placed her handbag on the table, her scarf beside it, removed her watch, her shoes, each movement deliberate, controlled, a lifetime of rehearsing compliance. The agent rifled through her belongings, fingers grazing over the smooth leather of her notebook. He flipped it open without permission, eyes scanning the carefully written pages as though searching for something incriminating. Something foreign, something that did not belong. "Looks fancy," he muttered. "It's a journal," Josephine replied evenly. There was a pause, a barely perceptible one, but there nonetheless. Then, he shut the book, slid it back toward her with a nod, and gestured for her to proceed. "You're good to go. Good to go," as if she had been waiting for their approval to move forward. She gathered her belongings with the same quiet precision, reassembling herself the way she had done 1,000 times before. Scarf draped, watch fastened, shoes slipped back on, and then, without hesitation, she walked past them, not because she had been allowed to, because she chose to. The gate, and the familiar ritual. By the time she reached the boarding area, the waiting passengers were scattered about in a tableau of modern travel. Businessmen hunched over laptops, families corralling restless children, an elderly couple murmuring softly to each other. It was, in all appearances, an ordinary scene. And yet, Josephine had long understood that nothing was ever just ordinary. She took a seat near the window, setting her notebook on her lap, opening it to a blank page. Writing had always been her shield, her sword, her proof that she existed beyond what people assumed of her. As she put pen to paper, she became aware of a presence nearby. A young man, perhaps in his 20s, dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie. He had been watching her. Not openly, not in the crude way that some did, but with recognition. She did not acknowledge him, but she knew his type. Young, black, familiar with the quiet indignities. He wasn't watching out of curiosity. He was watching because he knew. Across the room, at the gate desk, the same two agents from check-in stood, their smirks still lingering, their amusement not yet spent. Lisa, the blonde one, spoke first, her voice carrying just enough to be heard. "Oh, look, it's her again." Her colleague chuckled, shaking his head. "Must be nice." Josephine did not flinch, did not turn. She only listened. "She's probably flying on someone else's points," Lisa murmured, her voice sweet with condescension. "Or saved up her whole life for this one trip," Greg added, His amusement casual, effortless. They laughed, low and knowing. They did not know that the young man nearby was recording them. And they certainly did not know that the woman they mocked held their futures in her hands. Josephine closed her notebook gently, allowing herself a small, knowing smile. She had been tested before. And she knew. The real reckoning was yet to come. The announcement rang through the terminal. Measured, sterile, first-class passengers may now board. Josephine Langston closed her notebook. Her movements deliberate. She gathered her things with a quiet grace that no one could take from her. Not the smirking agents at the gate. Not the security officer who had combed through her belongings as if searching for a reason to deny her passage. And certainly not the voices that had long whispered in the back of her mind. Asking, how long before they try to remind you that you do not belong? She had learned to answer them with her very existence. Her steps were slow, unhurried, as she moved toward the boarding counter. The laughter behind her had faded. But she carried it with her. Not as a wound, but as a record. Lauren, the blonde gate agent, straightened as she approached, her lips pulling into something that imitated a smile but carried none of the warmth. Oh, it's you again, she said, reaching for the ticket. Josephine handed it over without a word. Lauren scanned it. A green light flashed. She returned the ticket, flicking her wrist just enough to make the gesture dismissive. Enjoy your flight, she said, her voice coated in something syrupy. Something that mocked the very act of civility. Josephine met her gaze, steady, unreadable. Thank you, she said simply, taking her ticket and stepping past them. Behind her, another low murmur. Unbelievable, Lauren muttered to Greg. She probably pulled some strings. He replied, shaking his head. They believed their voices were soft enough to go unheard. They were wrong. The flight, and the thin veneer of service. The jet bridge was quiet. The hum of the aircraft growing louder as she approached. The first-class cabin was bathed in soft, artificial light, plush seats, carefully curated comfort, the illusion of exclusivity. A flight attendant stood at the entrance. Her uniform pristine, her expression tight. Natalie. She glanced at Josephine, took in the scarf, the elegance, the poise, and somewhere in that brief exchange, made a decision. Welcome aboard, she said, her voice clipped. She glanced at the ticket in Josephine's hand. First class, right this way. No warmth, no politeness wasted where she believed it was not needed. Josephine walked past her, feeling the weight of the moment, feeling the expectation. She had seen this before. The way the world tilted slightly when people like Natalie were forced to serve people like her. She found her seat, a window position, and a second row. She settled in, placing her notebook on the tray table. She took a breath. For a few moments, there was quiet. Then, the presence returned. Natalie appeared with a tray of pre-departure drinks. Champagne, sparkling water. Her hands moved fluidly from seat to seat, offering glasses with polite efficiency. Until she reached Josephine. Then, for the first time, the rhythm faltered. Drink before takeoff? Natalie asked. The words automatic, but the tone, different. Strained. Just water, Josephine replied. Natalie nodded. The movement was brisk. Too brisk. As she passed the glass, her hand tilted. A few drops of water spilled onto Josephine's tray table. Natalie straightened. A smile flickered across her lips. Brief, unapologetic. Oops, she said. Turbulence already. She waited for a reaction, waited for the moment Josephine would flinch, frown, and let the crack show. But Josephine only took the glass, set it down, and reached for a napkin. She wiped the table slowly, methodically, as though the act itself was an exercise in patience. Thank you, she said. Natalie hesitated. Then, as if disappointed, she moved on. The passenger who knew, from his seat in the economy, Elijah had been watching. A young man, sharp-eyed, dressed in a hoodie and jeans. A witness to the ritual. He had seen it before. He had lived it before. The check-in smirks, the random screenings, the thinly veiled challenges disguised as customer service. He had been recording since the gate. Now, his phone hovered in his lap, capturing the exchange between Natalie and Josephine. The small, Deliberate insult dressed as an accident. His fingers tightened around the phone. Because he knew what this was. It was not hatred. It was disbelief. Disbelief that Josephine was here. In this space. Moving through it as though it belonged to her just as much as it belonged to them. They had spent their lives believing in an order. And now, that order has been disrupted. The plane began to taxi. The cabin tilting slightly as it prepared for takeoff. Elijah exhaled, his grip on the phone tightening. He didn't know who Josephine was. But he knew what she was fighting. And he wasn't sure yet if he would intervene. But he knew he would not be silent. The plane tilted upward, the engines roaring with a force that sent a tremor through the cabin. Josephine Langston sat perfectly still, watching the city shrink beneath her. The landscape dissolving into a patchwork of streets and buildings. The world was small from up here, insignificant in its sprawl. But she knew better. She knew that no matter how high one rose, the weight of history remained anchored to the bones. She turned her attention back to the cabin. The plane had reached its cruising altitude, and the illusion of tranquility had returned. Passengers murmuring in hushed tones. Fingers tapping at keyboards. Ice clinking in glasses as drinks were poured and distributed. Josephine did not need to turn her head to know that she was still being watched. Not openly, not with the crude aggression of a different era, but with something quieter, more insidious, a kind of resentment wrapped in civility. The service that wasn't. Natalie reappeared, moving through first class with the practiced ease of someone who had learned how to disguise intention. She handed out menus, her voice smooth and mechanical. Here's the menu for today's service. Let me know if you have any questions. She said it the same way to each passenger. Until she reached Josephine. Then, something shifted. The rhythm broke. The words came a second too fast. The movement a fraction too brisk. She thrust the menu forward, her fingers barely releasing it before she had already turned to the next passenger. A dismissal. A refusal to engage. Josephine accepted the menu in silence. She knew what this was. It was the same game. Played 1,000 times over. The rules were simple. We will not say it. But you will feel it. She unfolded the menu with care. Scanning the options. Not because she needed to. But because she refused to be hurried. Refused to be made smaller. Further back in the plane. Elijah was still watching. Still recording. Still waiting. The meal. And the lesson in power. The cart came next. Passengers in first class received their trays with ease. Natalie served them with a smile that had been perfected. Rehearsed. Then, she reached Josephine. The tray landed with a clink. The utensils rattling from the force. Natalie didn't look at her. Didn't say enjoy your meal. Didn't offer the careful pleasantries she had given the others. She was waiting. Waiting for Josephine to flinch. To hesitate. To do anything that might validate the belief that she did not belong here. Josephine did nothing. She picked up her fork. Her movements unhurried. She ate her meal slowly. As though savoring it. As though refusing to be rushed from the table. It was a quiet defiance. One that said, I have seen this before. And I am still here. The passenger who spoke. From his seat, Elijah exhaled. He could feel his own pulse thrumming. The familiar frustration lodged beneath his ribs. He had recorded everything. But now, he wasn't sure recording was enough. As Natalie passed by again, he spoke, low, firm. Excuse me. She turned, her brows arching in surprise. Yes? Elijah tilted his head slightly. His voice casual. Too casual. Why did you drop her tray? Natalie blinked. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She hadn't expected this. Because this was never supposed to be acknowledged. This was supposed to remain in the realm of things felt. But never spoken. She gave a tight-lipped smile. I didn't drop anything. Elijah held her gaze. You did. A flicker of irritation crossed her face. But she smoothed it over quickly. Turning without another word. Josephine had watched the exchange from the corner of her eye. She did not look at Elijah. But for the first time, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Because something had changed. Because now, it was no longer just her fight. The hum of the engines had settled into a steady drone. A sound that was meant to lull passengers into comfort. Into submission. A sound that masked the quiet conflicts unfolding in the small, confined world of the aircraft. Josephine Langston had always understood that there were two journeys on every flight. One written on the ticket, the other woven into the fabric of existence. The first was simple, a to-be departure to destination. The second? It was the navigation of space, of presence, of belonging. And here, 35,000 feet above the world, she was being reminded, again, always, that for people like her, no space was ever truly theirs. The thinly veiled challenge. Natalie had not spoken to Josephine since the meal service. But she had spoken about her. A few rows away, hushed voices spilled over the aisle. Two passengers, middle-aged, well-dressed, confident in the certainty of their place in the world. "I don't get it," one of them murmured. "Why would someone like that need first class?" Josephine did not react. She had long learned that dignity is often measured by what one chooses to ignore. But Elijah heard. And Elijah reacted. His seatbelt clicked open, and before reason could temper his frustration, he turned in his seat. "Someone like what?" he asked. His voice even, but carrying the sharp edge of a challenge. The man looked at him, taken aback. A split second of hesitation, of calculation. "Nothing," he muttered, turning his gaze forward. That was how it worked. That was how they played the game. The rule had always been simple. Say it just quietly enough that you can pretend it was never said at all. But this time, Elijah had forced it into the light. And light has a way of making people uncomfortable. Josephine did not turn to face him. But her posture straightened. Not in gratitude. In recognition. The manufactured mistake. Minutes passed. And then, Natalie returned. This time, there was no tray. No offer of service. Only an expression practiced in false concern. She leaned down slightly, voice hushed. Performative. "Ma'am, I need to see your ticket." Josephine did not move. "Why?" Natalie's smile flickered. "It's just a routine check." Routine. A word that had been twisted so many times. It no longer meant what it claimed. Josephine reached into her bag, pulled out her ticket, and handed it over with the same deliberate slowness that had become her only weapon. Natalie examined it. Too long. Far too long. Then she sighed. A performance in itself. And handed it back. "My apologies," she said. "There was some confusion about whether you were in the correct seat." The words sat heavy between them. They both knew what they meant. Because there had been no confusion. Because this was the real message. You are still being watched. You are still being questioned. We are still deciding whether you belong. Josephine took the ticket, slipped it back into her bag. Then, without blinking, without breaking, she looked directly into Natalie's eyes and said, "Make sure it doesn't happen again." It was the way she said it. Not pleading, not angry, just absolute. A quiet, steady command. Natalie stepped back, her mouth pressing into a thin line. She did not respond, because she had already lost. The power of being seen. The seatbelt light flickered on. The descent had begun. Josephine turned toward the window, watching as the land below came back into focus. The city growing larger, sharper. She had expected this flight to test her. But something was different now. Something had shifted. She turned her head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of Elijah a few rows behind. He met her gaze, his phone still in his hand, his expression unreadable. He had seen. He had recorded. And in a world where silence had always been the accomplice of injustice, to be seen was no small thing. The descent was smooth, the cabin filled with the low murmur of passengers preparing for landing. Josephine Langston remained still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her expression unreadable. Outside the window, the city below grew larger, the lights glowing in the early evening haze. She had spent the flight being tested. And she had passed. Not because she had fought, but because she had refused to let them see her struggle. That was the oldest lesson of all. That dignity was not something the world gave. It was something one chose to hold onto. And yet, she knew better than to believe it was over. Because for people like her, it was never over. The final encounter. The plane landed with a jolt. The weight of the aircraft pressing down as it slowed to a crawl. There was a shuffling of bodies. The impatient clatter of seatbelts being undone too soon. The collective urgency to escape the confinement of the cabin. The first-class passengers stood first, stretching, gathering their expensive carry-ons. Already moving toward the aisle before the doors had even opened. Josephine took her time. When she finally stood, her movements unhurried. She felt it before she saw it. Natalie watching her. One last challenge. One last silent exchange. The same woman who had spent the flight dismissing her now stood at the door, offering the same polite farewell she had given every other passenger. But something in her expression was tighter now. Less certain. Josephine approached. Natalie's voice was flat. "Have a nice day." Josephine paused. Not long. Not enough to make a scene. Just long enough for the air between them to shift. She turned her head slightly, looking directly into Natalie's eyes. And then, with the faintest, most deliberate smile, she said, "You too." Nothing more. Nothing less. Natalie blinked. Just a flicker. And Josephine saw it. Saw the way the power had shifted. The door opened behind her. And she stepped forward, past the threshold, past the unwritten rules they had tried to enforce, into the terminal where the world was waiting. The meeting they never expected. The airport was bustling with movement. People rushing to baggage claim, to connecting flights, to the rest of their lives. Josephine walked with quiet purpose, her suitcase gliding effortlessly behind her. She moved past the crowds, past the noise, past the weight of the flight she had just endured. Then, she saw him, a man in a sharp suit, tall, waiting near the exit with a sign. Her name was on it. And beneath it, in crisp black lettering, Chief Executive Officer. She approached, her presence still commanding, still composed. The man's eyes widened slightly. Not in shock, but in recognition. "Ms. Langston," he said warmly, extending a hand. "Welcome to headquarters." She shook his hand with poise. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett." The exchange was polite, professional, but she could see it in his eyes. The silent question. How was the flight? She did not answer. Not yet. The truth that would be told. Further back, near the terminal entrance, Elijah stood alone. His phone was in his pocket now. But he had the footage. He had the proof. For a moment, he simply watched. He had not known who she was. Not until now. But he had known what she was. A woman who had walked through fire without once letting them see her burn. Josephine did not turn back toward him. But somehow, she knew he was still watching. And she knew, too, that the story of what had happened on that plane would not stay there. Because now, it would be told. By him. By her. And by the weight of justice that was already coming. As she stepped into the private car waiting outside, she allowed herself one last glance at the airport behind her. She had come here expecting a flight. She was leaving with a reckoning. The city sprawled beneath the tinted windows of the car. A living thing of steel and glass, of motion and consequence. Josephine Langston sat in the back seat, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. Her expression unreadable. She had left the airport behind. But she carried it with her. The stifled laughter, the careful dismissals, the way power had been wielded in whispers and glances. There were two kinds of wounds in this world. The ones that bled and the ones that lingered. She had survived the second kind all her life. And she had no intention of letting them fester. The boardroom and the silence that followed. The building loomed ahead, sleek and modern, its facade a monument to commerce. It was the beating heart of the airline. The place where decisions were made. Where policies were crafted. Where the illusion of fairness was maintained. Josephine stepped inside. The executive lounge was quiet. Not the comforting silence of stillness, but the charged quiet of expectation. They were waiting for her. She had barely settled into her seat when Mr. Bennett entered. His face carefully composed. "I trust your flight was comfortable," he said. She met his gaze. "Comfortable enough," she said. There was a pause. A hesitation. Because they both knew it was a lie. He exhaled, nodding slightly, then tapped a few buttons on his tablet. "Before we begin," he said, "there's something I believe you should see. The evidence that could not be ignored." The screen behind him lit up. At first, there was only the hum of the airport in the background. The soft chatter of passengers. Then, the gate agents. Lauren's smirk. Greg's laughter. The words spoken just under their breath. Caught on a recording they had never intended to exist. She's probably flying on someone else's points. Or saved up her whole life for this one trip. A shift in the footage. Now the cabin crew. Natalie's carelessness. The spilled water. The tray dropped too harshly. The condescending glances. Then, the final moment. The way she had demanded to see Josephine's ticket long after she had taken her seat. The weight of it settled into the room. And no one spoke. Because of this. This was not speculation. This was undeniable. The eyes that would no longer look away. Mr. Bennet cleared his throat. His voice steady but softer now. This was recorded by a passenger. He said, a young man sitting in the coach. Josephine exhaled. Elijah. She had known, even then, that he would not let the moment disappear. She turned back to Bennet. What do you plan to do about it? He hesitated. She let the silence stretch. Because she knew what they wanted. They wanted her to say, forget it, it wasn't that bad, no need to escalate. But she was not here for their comfort. She was here for accountability. Finally, he nodded. The individuals involved will be brought in for a formal review. He said, there will be consequences. Josephine tilted her head slightly. She did not thank him. Because justice was not a favor. It was a demand. And she had made hers clear. The weight of names. An hour later, she stood by the window of her new office. Looking out over the city. The sky still streaked with the last remnants of daylight. Her name was on the door now. Chief Executive Officer. A title. A responsibility. A reckoning. The past few hours had been a reminder that power was never freely given. It had to be taken. Held. And wielded with purpose. She had done it before. She would do it again. And now, they would know her name. Not just as a passenger. But as the woman who would decide who stayed and who would be gone. The sky had deepened to the color of ink. The city beneath it a constellation of moving lights. Josephine Langston stood at the window of her office. Her reflection staring back at her. A woman who had fought to be here. Who had refused to be dismissed. She had won today. But victories like these were never without cost. The truth of America, as she had always known it, was that power was not transferred peacefully. It was taken. And when taken by someone who was never meant to hold it. It came with a price. The reckoning in the boardroom. The room was cold, the air thick with unspoken tension. 3 seats filled in front of her. 3 faces familiar in their defiance. Their disbelief. Lauren. Greg. Natalie. They sat before her now not as gatekeepers. But as the accused. She watched them. Unmoving. Not angry. Not triumphant. Simply tired. Because this moment. This exact moment. Was proof of something she had always understood. That it had never been about service. Never about policy. Never about a spilled glass of water or a misplaced ticket. It had been about control. About who was meant to serve. And who was never meant to be served. She let the silence stretch until they began to fidget. Then, she spoke. You know why you're here. No one answered. Of course they didn't. Lauren's hands were folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes darting between Josephine and Mr. Bennet. Waiting for permission to explain herself. Greg shifted uncomfortably. His usual arrogance dampened but not yet extinguished. Natalie sat stiffly. Her jaw tight. Her silence a refusal. Josephine let out a slow breath. Tapping her fingers lightly against the table. Let's make this simple, she said. I want each of you to explain your actions. More silence. Then, Lauren spoke first. It was a misunderstanding, she said, her voice polished. Professional. We never intended to. Quote. You did. Josephine interrupted. Her voice like cut stone. Lauren's mouth snapped shut. Josephine turned her gaze to Greg. You participated, she said. You stood there and laughed. You made it clear that someone like me had no place where I was. Greg's throat bobbed. It wasn't. Quote. Josephine cut him off again. And you, she said, turning to Natalie, had every opportunity to extend basic human decency. You chose not to. Natalie's lips parted, her composure cracking just slightly. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You're blowing this out of proportion. Josephine leaned forward. No, she said, her voice steady. What's ridiculous is that you're only concerned now that someone's watching. The moment of judgment. Josephine straightened. I will be clear, she said. She turned to Lauren and Greg. You are both terminated immediately. Lauren's face paled. Greg exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You can't. Quote. I can, Josephine said. And I am. Then, she turned to Natalie. The woman's eyes flashed, not with regret, but with anger. A particular kind of anger that had nothing to do with the loss of a job. And everything to do with the fact that she had been held accountable by the very person she had tried to dismiss. Josephine tilted her head slightly. You will be placed on unpaid leave, she said. If you return, it will be in a different capacity. You will not work in first class again. Natalie's hands clenched into fists. This isn't fair, she whispered. Josephine exhaled. Fair? She repeated. You want to talk about fair? She let the words hang between them. Let their weight settle. Then, she stood. This conversation is over. She turned and walked to the door, stepping past them the way she had stepped past their judgment at the gate. And when she left them behind, she did not look back. What it meant to win. Later, in the stillness of her office, Josephine sat at her desk, a blank sheet of paper before her. The fight was over. But the war? It was never over. She knew that tomorrow, there would be whispers in the halls. Questions. Doubts. Some would resent her. Some would fear her. And some would never forgive her for being in a position where she could make decisions at all. But that was the nature of change. It did not ask permission. It did not apologize. It simply arrived. She picked up her pen. She began to write. Because the story was not done. And because there was still so much to tell.